Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Horizon Lodge on this lovely Tuesday evening here in Seattle. Thank you for coming, and if you want, I want to thank Horizon for making the space available for me to present this class. If you are able to, donations really help us to continue doing this work. Someone new to the study of Thelema, reading the introductory instructions in Liber O finds the following. The student must first obtain a thorough knowledge of Book 777, especially of columns 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 9, 11, 12, 14, 17, 15, 16, etc. There's a lot. Immediately after this list of more than 4 dozen columns to be learned, we find this encouraging sentence. When these are committed to memory, he will begin to understand the nature of these correspondences. Elsewhere, in Liber Cordis Cincti Serpente, one of the holy books of Thelema, we find verses like this. This is chapter 2, verse 1. I passed into the mountain of lapis lazuli, even as a green hawk between the pillars of turquoise that is seated upon the throne of the east. Someone reading this could, and probably should, ask themselves, why turquoise? Why a hawk? Why green? Or a first-time attendee of the Gnostic Mass may wonder, why is the altar cloth crimson and not, say, blue? Why is the priest's robe scarlet and gold instead of, say, purple? In all of these passages, Crowley is using or referring to the concept of correspondence, something that is essential for understanding his writing. This talk will introduce the concept of correspondence and examples of its history, give examples of its usage in the Thelemic corpus, and provide some practical suggestions for learning this material. That being said, this is not a talk on the philosophy of correspondence, or about its history, or about the Kabbalah. My intent for this talk is to give you some practical knowledge that is useful for learning this material, so you could go and read Crowley more effectively, or understand a ritual, or write your own. What is a correspondence? The idea of correspondence does not originate with Crowley, nor with the Golden Dawn, where he received his magical training. It is therefore appropriate for us to look outside the Thelemic corpus for an understanding of what correspondence is and what it means. Correspondence is a concept that is ubiquitous in Western esotericism. According to Antoine Fevre, it is one of the 4 necessary characteristics that define esotericism. There we go. So here we have the 4 necessary characteristics of esotericism. We're going to focus on the first 2 here, correspondences and living nature. The other 2 are imagination and mediation and transmutation. There's another one, the 2 extrinsic characteristics of esotericism that are relevant. One is the concordance of traditions. And that's the idea that different traditions kind of are saying the same things in different ways. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Correspondence is a natural result of the idea of a microcosm and macrocosm, expressed concisely in the Emerald Tablet of Hermes in the phrase, that which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below. This idea that various layers or planes of existence mirror or reflect each other implies that if, for instance, the planet Mars is a spiritual entity in the planetary and celestial world, oh, there it is, then there must be an analog of that entity in the mineral or animal worlds, as well as other categories such as color, sound, or scent, really any category that you can think of. So a correspondence appears to be a relationship between two or more things, wherein they are manifestations of the same spiritual reality on different layers or planes. If we take this idea seriously, there are two implications of this that I think are really important. First, the things which correspond are expressions of the same spiritual idea. If I pay attention in the right way, I can learn something about whatever spiritual idea is expressed by Mars from a wolf or a bear or a sword or iron. These things are also martial. Second, we could use these correspondences to interact in a more direct way with these spiritual entities. If I gather together a bunch of objects that are martial, that actually correspond to Mars, a sword or a bear skin, draperies, or other objects that are red, fangs made of iron, I'm not only gathering together things that are expressive of the idea of Mars, I'm actually bringing together into the same place the spiritual energy of Mars itself, but in physical form. To me, this last point is crucially important, since if we accept this premise and take it to its logical conclusion, we find that everything we encounter or interact with is the physical form of some god or spiritual entity. The correspondences that Crowley published in 777 are those that he learned at the Golden Dawn, supplemented by his own research, and I think as Alan Bennett as well. However, this concept and those correspondences do not originate with the Golden Dawn. It's a very ancient concept. We find gods associated with particular symbols or iconography as some of the oldest literature that survives. For instance, we find Aphrodite associated with doves and sparrows as early as Sappho in the 5th and 6th centuries BC. Rich-throned, immortal Aphrodite, scheming daughter of Zeus, I pray you, with pain and sickness, queen, crush not my heart, but come, if ever in the past you heard my voice from afar and hearkened, and left your father's halls and came, with gold chariot yoked and pretty sparrows, brought you swiftly across the dark earth, fluttering wings from heaven through the air. I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't read you some Sappho, if given the opportunity. But you can see that even here, 2,600 years ago, Aphrodite is already associated with these animals. Similarly, in the very first book of the Iliad, we find Apollo, for instance, associated with mice, with his bow and arrows, and with sickness and health. Here's a passage where, hear me, god of the silver bow, who stands over Chrysi and holy Scylla, and rules mightily over Tenedos, Sminthean god. Sminthean is from Sminthos, a Greek word for mouse. Of course, we have much earlier literature than Sappho or Homer. This is just the particular corpus that I'm most familiar with. Much of the literature of pharaonic Egypt is older by far. But my purpose here isn't to give you the oldest examples of what came to be the correspondences we find in 777, but rather to give some illustration of how these associations did not come out of nowhere. They were collected throughout time. Similarly, we find the Orphic hymns, which very, very roughly date from around the 1st or 1st century BC to the 1st century AD, have perfumes associated with each of them. The same perfumes are used over and over again, and they're not always the same scents that are listed in 777. But here we see the idea of a certain scent being associated with the invocation of a particular god. Another trend that we find very early is associating gods from different pantheons. This is the concordance of traditions I mentioned earlier. For instance, in Book 2 of the History, Herodotus identifies the Egyptian god Osiris with the Greek god Dionysus. No gods are worshipped by all Egyptians in common, except Isis and Osiris, who they say is Dionysus. In the same chapter, he says, the Egyptians call Zeus Ammon, or we'd say Amun now. So there was very early this idea that, these different gods were just different names in different languages for the same thing. We see attempts to systematize all of these associations, at least by the Renaissance. For instance, in Agrippa, we find lists of places associated with each planet. Jupiter is appointed any place of privilege. Mars holds all places that are fiery and bloody. The sun has bright places. Venus inhabits beautiful fountains, green meadows, etc. We also find fumigations appropriate to the planets and signs. The fumigations for the planets are more complex than what we typically think of as a correspondence. Some one or more kind of atomic things. In fact, some of them are pretty wild, but those for the signs of the zodiac are closer to what we'd think of as correspondences, though, again, the associations themselves are not what we tend to use today. The most relevant of these systematization attempts, and in my opinion, the most successful, begins with the application of Kabbalistic ideas. I want to stop here for a moment and give a digression and disclaimer about the Kabbalah as we use it in Thelema. In the 0th chapter of Magick in Theory and Practice, called The Magical Theory of the Universe, Crowley analogizes the system of correspondences and the paths of the Tree of Life to a filing cabinet which is filled up with all the knowledge of its owner. You could certainly use them like that, and that's fine. There are correspondences in the Sefer Yetzirah. For instance, in chapter 3, verse 2, three mothers, Aleph, Mem, Shin, a great mystical secret, covered and concealed with 6 rings, and from them emanated air, water, and fire. Or, in chapter 3, verse 5, 3 mothers, Aleph, Mem, Shin, and the year are the hot, the cold, and the temperate. So these ideas of correspondence, one thing in the spiritual realm corresponding to something in the physical realm, are present in the early Kabbalistic literature. However, a lot of Thelemites seem to think that that's the extent of the Kabbalah, and that's not really correct. What we're talking about here is one small aspect of the traditional Kabbalah that was adopted by Christian Kabbalists and eventually became what we use today. There are still people practicing traditional Kabbalah, and there's a whole other world of depth there. This is just a small part of that. All that being said, this talk isn't about the Kabbalah. My key point here is that Crowley learned to use the 32 paths of the Kabbalistic Tree of Life to organize all of these correspondences. He learned that from his training in the Golden Dawn. Those 32 paths consist of the 10 Sephirot, or the first 10 natural numbers, and the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. This is a great system for organizing all of these ideas. There's 3 reasons I think it's pretty great, and is probably some kind of local maximum. First, numbers are pretty fundamental to how we understand the world today. And 10 in particular is really convenient for most people for reasons that are easily at hand. Second, sounds are also pretty fundamental, and letters represent those sounds. That's how we communicate in a really basic way. And third, there's a really nice arrangement of the letters and numbers called the Tree of Life that relates them all together in various ways. Most details about the Tree of Life are kind of out of scope for this talk, but I'll give some advice for how to learn it at the end of the talk. In any case, it is this arrangement of 32 paths, 10 integers, and 22 letters that Crowley uses to organize correspondences in 777. Let's return to the examples I gave at the beginning of the talk, starting with the excerpt from Liber Cordis Cincti Serpente. I chose this particular verse carefully, partly because there's some interesting imagery in it, and partly because Crowley wrote useful commentary on it that we can refer to, and also because it illustrates a little bit of a gotcha that you'll run into if you stick with this work long enough. Let's look at this verse again, pick it apart using some really basic correspondences that I'll provide, and then compare what we come up with about what that might mean to what Crowley wrote about it. Also, while this is a Class A document, it's not the book of the law, so the comment does not apply to this. I can talk about it, or we could talk about what it might mean. Don't at me. Here we go. I passed into the mountain of lapis lazuli, even as a green hawk between the pillars of turquoise that is seated upon the throne of the east. There's a lot of imagery here. Before I start picking it apart, it's really good, in my opinion, to just sit with that for a moment. Sit with the words and the sounds and the images, and let these images come into your mind. When we're doing analytical work with things like this, it's important to remember that these are our holy books, and that there is still a certain poetry here, and sometimes it's really beautiful. I passed into the mountain of lapis lazuli, even as a green hawk between the pillars of turquoise that is seated upon the throne of the east. Okay, let's start with lapis lazuli. Lapis lazuli is the stone of the path of Kaf, attributed to Jupiter. So anyone have any ideas why it might be attributed to Jupiter here?
Because it's blue?
It is blue. That's why it'd be attributed to Jupiter. Why might the mountain be attributed to Jupiter, though?
Well, the mountain.
Yeah, I probably should have been a little more clear there.
Because it's big and Jupiter's big?
That might be why. Any ideas?
Jupiter's home is on Olympus, a tall mountain, and mountains reach up into the clouds, which are also symbolic of
Jupiter? All right, I'll buy it. How about the hawk? A hawk is pretty much always going to be Horus or Ra Horkuit in Thelema. But this hawk is green. Green is attributed to Venus. Why might this hawk be associated with Venus?
perhaps the passage is alluding to joy or love or union, heading in that direction.
Makes sense to me. Okay, so now we've got pillars of turquoise. Turquoise is attributed to both Chokmah, the number 2, or wisdom, in the zodiac, and to the letter Dalet, attributed to Venus. Which do you think it's referencing here, and why?
Pokemon?
Yeah?
Because it's the sky, or
Yeah?
the Pokemon kind of, that's what turquoise is, kind of the sky, I guess.
Yeah, fair enough. And how about the pillars? That's not really a 777 thing, but
I mean, that's a big question, but yeah, the pillars just in general come from the Golden Dawn and from Masonry and back to Enoch and etc.
pillars from Enoch. All right. And this green hawk is seated upon the throne of the east. And the east is attributed to air. Does anyone have any ideas about why the hawk is seated upon the throne of the east?
He's the rising sun.
Okay. So you would say it probably has nothing to do with air in this case, just...
Yeah, I mean, east and west and Egyptian, the cosmology, they're sort of like reference certain gods, like the hawk that's in the west is sort of a different symbol for something else.
Sure.
In the Book of the Law, it says Rahor Khalid has taken his seat in
Okay.
the equinox of the gods. So here of the hawk symbolism is also a symbol of birth or rebirth.
Yeah.
Yeah, the throne in the east is also, more to Jim's point, is like a symbol of initiation. That's where the initiator sits in masonry. So they're indicating that he's the new initiator.
All right. So if we take all those ideas, does anyone want to take a crack, or do we want to collectively take a crack at what this verse might be talking about, or what it might mean in aggregate? It's a taller ask.
Well, it seems to be this second half in particular seems to be referring to the idea of birth or rebirth, love, a sign of love and power in the east, and the mountain of lapis lazuli passing into it. Really, he himself as identified with Jupiter as transmitting the word in a particularly Jupiterian way. So maybe he's referring to a symbol of his own relationship with the Lord of the Aeon. Power.
All right. Yeah, that sounds at least plausible. All right. Well, let's take a look at what Crowley wrote about this verse. Describes the passage of the divine consciousness, the hawk, colored by love, green, into the world of starry space, lapis lazuli, which is blue with specks of gold, by a balanced path from earth to heaven, the pillars of turquoise. The east is the quarter attributed to air, and the hawk is there seated, that is, stable, not to be distracted by whatever thoughts arise in the mind. I have a note here to ask if we were close. I'm not totally sure we were. There is a little bit of a gotcha here, and that lapis lazuli is the world of starry space because it looks kind of like the night sky. So when you're interpreting Crowley, or presumably any other esoteric writer, that's something that you have to deal with sometimes. Sometimes the correspondence is meant in a very precise technical sense. For instance, green, therefore Venus, therefore love, like we see with the green hawk. And sometimes it's a little bit more like, well, this looks like that, so there you go. Just maybe not the easiest thing. Why don't we look at the questions about the Mass that I put forward at the beginning? Why is the altar cloth crimson? Crimson is the king's scale of Binah, which means understanding, and is attributed to Saturn. Does anyone have any idea what that means, or might mean in the context of the altar cloth?
It's why the altar is crimson.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is a direct reference to Binah, but it is reference to the Yade Vave formula. The daughter is taken from Malkuth and set upon Binah, the throne of the mother.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that certainly makes sense. And yeah, Binah is how the supernals look to people who aren't in them. How about the priest's scarlet robe? Scarlet is attributed to Geburah, which is Mars and strength, as well as to the letters He and Pe, which are respectively attributed to Aries or Aquarius, but let's just say Aries. Please don't get me started. And Mars. What might that mean?
It's also attributed to Shin.
Because of fire?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I would say. He's just fire in the equations.
Yeah.
It's also going to become Thou, or the son of Tetragrammaton, which is like the Lamb of God.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
And the union between God and man. And so he's going to be a stand-in for like a Jesus Christ-like figure in the Mass, just as the priest in the Roman.
Yeah, the Aries is the lamb.
Mars would be good too because he's the male energy generally. He's carrying a spear around.
Yeah.
The priestess is more connected with Mars because of the 5 crosses.
Oh. 5 crosses are a reference to marriage, not to martialism.
I disagree.
With the correspondence of Iamblichus.
That's not in 777, Scott.
Should be.
Well, so I checked, and Sabazius doesn't have anything one way or the other explaining these particular correspondences on his website. So we're just going to have to be satisfied with thinking for ourselves this time and taking a little bit of a risk. I believe in us. All right. So I promised you at the beginning that I'd give some useful tips for learning all of these correspondences. Hopefully by the end of this, you'll be a correspondence master in 32 difficult lessons. My first suggestion, and some people might disagree with me, but I don't care, is that you read a book or two on the Hermetic Qabalah. I personally found Dion Fortune's book, The Mystical Kabbalah, to be really helpful when I was first starting out. Though you do have to deal with some kind of Christian-y stuff. I recommend just biting the bullet and trying to absorb what she has to say about the way that the various concepts relate to each other. If that's not your thing, I get it. Some people really like Lon Milo Duquette's book, The Chicken Kabbalah. I personally didn't find it super helpful, but I'd already been doing this for quite a while when I finally read that. You are not me, and your mileage may vary. Finally, there are people out there who will just say, start with Crowley, and that's fine, I guess. But the introductory material in 777 is really pretty dense. I tried reading Crowley straight out of the gate when I was first starting out. Reading the Magical Theory of the Universe and Magic and Theory and Practice and the essay in 777, and just tried to go from that. But at least for me, I found it really helpful to have someone break that down so that I could absorb the concepts in a kind of more direct way before I eventually returned to what Crowley had written. My suspicion is that experience is going to be more common than not. Second, I really, really recommend using some kind of spaced repetition system or software. This is basically a turbocharged system of flashcards that you build with a program or in a box or on your phone or whatever. And then it keeps track of how difficult or easy a particular note was for you, and it shows the harder things sooner and the easier things later, depending on how good you are at it. If you go ahead and learn all of the tables of correspondences that Crowley recommends in the beginning of Liber O, that is hundreds and hundreds of pieces of information. You're just memorizing an Excel sheet. So it's really useful to have a program that keeps track of that for you so that you drill the things that are hard and that you need to practice, and that you don't drill the things that are easy and you don't need to practice. I personally use Anki, but there are other good options out there. Third, possibly the most important, this is really two. Don't learn if you don't understand, and always learn before you memorize. These are crucially important. I'm going to give you an example. Here we go. This is from Brother Scott's wonderful scans of the equinox. Don't learn if you don't understand. Raise your hand if you know the Coptic alphabet. Yeah. We'll call that a no. So the table of Egyptian god names in 777 has some that are in Coptic. And this principle would argue that if you don't know the Coptic alphabet, if you don't know what those letters are, you are wasting your time trying to learn that. They're just squiggles to you, and it has no meaning or content. If you want to learn those, it would probably be beneficial to go ahead and learn the Coptic alphabet first, so you at least know what sounds those squiggles go with. And because if you just memorize how to make those squiggles without associating them with other ideas, you're not putting things together. You're just stuffing things in your head, and you're wasting your time so hard. So that's, don't learn what you don't understand. You have to understand it first. And then the second part of that is learn before you memorize. Consider again this other column of Egyptian gods. If you don't know who these gods are, you really should learn who they are before you take the time to memorize them. Memorizing things can take a long time. And if you are looking at Tum Aishnet, however you say that, I don't know, and memorize that that goes with Shin without knowing who Tum Aishnet is, you're wasting your time. Then it's just sounds. Similarly, with the precious stones, or the perfumes, or plants, or animals, if you don't know what the plant Molly is, your time will be much better spent learning that before you learn that it's attributed to the Sephira Hod. Because if you don't know what it is, that means nothing. You learn nothing from that. This is a big one, stumbling block for me personally when I was trying to learn the color attributions. Because for the vast majority of my life, I was one of those people who would mentally translate the words scarlet, or crimson, or vermilion, or brick, or maroon into red. And that made it, all those words just kind of meaningless for me. I had to go and make those words have meaning before I could productively learn what they corresponded to. Very pleased to report that I've made a lot of progress in knowing what colors are. And coincidentally, this is actually one of the real benefits of doing this kind of work, that you kind of have to learn to refine your senses to tell the difference between, this color and that color, or scents, or like, what is that plant? You learn a little bit about the natural world, which is a great experience. And it's certainly been my experience. And there are a lot more of these kind of little helpful tips and tricks that I can talk about afterwards if people have questions, or I can post some links on the YouTube video description. But for the sake of everyone's time, my final official Correspondence Master learning tip for tonight is this. Once you've got all of this knowledge in your head, you've understood what the squiggles mean, you know what the words mean, and you've got them, orange associated with Hod, or a sword associated with Mars, and Gibora. Once you've got the knowledge and the dots that are connected, it's really helpful at that point to kind of synthesize it with some kind of projects that are appropriate to whatever you like to do. Once you've got the idea of the basic correspondence of, say, Dalet, just the letter attributed to Venus, it's a great idea to use that knowledge to create some art, or to make your own version of the Empress card, or to write a ritual, or something like that, anything like that. Anything that engages all of that knowledge and those connections that you've spent all that work building up in a holistic and creative way is how you take those disconnected bits and connect them and turn that into meaning, which is maybe the biggest benefit of all of this. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope this has been helpful. If you have learned something from this talk, please consider giving a donation to Horizon Lodge. The link will be in the video description. Love is the law, love under will.